Experts warn the proposed U.S.-Iran agreement may be built on sand. Consider the silence that follows a ceasefire announcement, not the relief, the silence. The way markets hold their breath, the way diplomats choose their words very, very carefully. That silence has a texture to it when the people who negotiated the deal aren't sure it will hold. We are in that silence right now. Here's what we know. In recent days, officials from Washington and Tehran have been circling a framework, a proposed agreement meant to ease one of the most entrenched and combustible standoffs on the planet. And the headlines, if you read them quickly, sound like progress. A deal is being discussed. Concessions are on the table. There is, the language goes, momentum. But here is the detail that doesn't quite add up. The analysts who have spent careers mapping these negotiations, the economists who track Iranian oil flows, the regional specialists who know what these agreements look like from the inside, they are not relieved. They are concerned. Not because a deal is being discussed, because of what the deal, as currently structured, leaves out. A truce with unresolved architecture isn't a peace. It's a pause with a countdown clock. Notice that. The experts aren't warning about the deal falling apart at the negotiating table. They're warning about what happens after it's signed. To understand why that matters, you need to hold two things in your head at once. The first is the history. The US and Iran have been in a grinding, low-temperature conflict for decades, punctuated by the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which briefly reorganized the entire regional architecture. Then, in 2018, the United States withdrew. Sanctions returned. Iran accelerated its nuclear program. The economic pressure on ordinary Iranians became severe. The region, already fractured, fragmented further. The second thing you need to hold is the structure of the Iranian economy itself. Iran is not a country west of. Here, sanctions apply cleanly. Oil is the circulatory system. It flows through state institutions, through the Revolutionary Guard's financial networks, through channels that have, over 40 years, become extraordinarily sophisticated at finding workarounds. When you want to negotiate with Iran over its nuclear program, you cannot extract the oil question and set it aside. They are the same question. They have always been the same question. The key players here are not just negotiators in suits sitting across polished tables. They are the hardliners inside Iran, who gain leverage every time an agreement fails. They are the Gulf states watching to see whether Washington's commitments mean anything. They are the European powers who stayed in the JCPOA after 2018 and are now trying to figure out what their position in any new agreement actually is. So here is what the evidence actually shows. According to economic and Middle East analysts speaking to Reuters, the draft framework currently, why being discussed, does not fully resolve three critical issues. The first is oil flows, specifically the conditions under which Iranian oil re-enters global markets, and who verifies compliance. The second is the nuclear program itself, and here the gap is significant. Enrichment levels, inspector access, and the timeline for any rollback remain contested. The third, and this is the one that tends to get underweighted in the headlines, is economic recovery. That last piece matters more than it might appear. One of the structural lessons of 2015 is that even when a deal is signed, the economic benefits to Iran materialized far more slowly than Iranian negotiators were told they would. Sanctions relief on paper did not instantly translate into foreign investment because international banks remained cautious about secondary sanctions risks. Ordinary Iranians waited and waited. That gap between the deal and the relief was weaponized by hardliners inside Iran to argue that engage men. Tea with the West was fundamentally futile. What the analysts are telling Reuters now is that the current framework risks repeating precisely that pattern. A short truce gets extended. The extension gets called a deal. The deal gets announced. And then the underlying tensions, unresolved oil questions, an enrichment program still running, an Iranian population that has learned to be skeptical of promises. Those tensions continue to generate pressure beneath the surface. The war's economic and strategic impact, they say, persists, even if the guns go quiet. There is also a verification problem, which deserves a moment of attention. Past agreements, and not just with Iran, have struggled with the gap between what is written into a framework and what is actually monitored. The IAEA has faced access restrictions before. The question of who certifies compliance and what happens when compliance is disputed is not a minor procedural matter. It is the mechanism on which everything else ends. Here is where everything clicks into place, and it clicks quietly. The concern is not that this deal will be rejected. The concern is that it will be accepted, announced, celebrated, offered to the world as a resolution, and that the gaps in its architecture will only become visible later, when they become crises. That is the pattern. It has happened before. It is not a conspiracy. It is something closer to institutional optimism, the tendency of negotiations to produce agreements that reflect what both parties need politically in the short term, rather than what the situation requires structurally over the long term. The analysts are not saying don't make a deal. They are saying be precise about what this deal actually solves. Because a ceasefire that leaves the economic pressure unresolved, that leaves the enrichment program intact above certain thresholds, that leaves oil sanctions in a state of ambiguity, that ceasefire has a very specific shelf life, and the clock on I. T starts the day it's signed. And here is the part that should concern all of us. The United States is operating in a global environment where the credibility of its agreements is itself a geopolitical asset. When a deal is signed and then phrased not because anyone acted in bad faith on the day it was announced, but because it was structurally incomplete from the start, the cost is not just diplomatic. It is informational. It tells every other country watching that American agreements are made for the news cycle and tested by reality later. There are parties watching this negotiation very carefully. China, which has deepened its own economic relationship with Iran. Russia, which has its own interests in Iranian regional influence. Israel, which has publicly and forcefully stated that any agreement leaving Iran's nuclear infrastructure intact is a threat to its security. Each of these actors is reading the text of any framework not just for what it says, but for how durable it looks. A fragile deal doesn't just fail between the US and Iran. It reshapes the expectations of everyone in the room who wasn't formally at the table. And domestically, this matters too. Any administration that announces a diplomatic achievement in this region will own it. If the architecture underneath that achievement turns out to be hollow, the political cost arrives on a delay, but it arrives. The precedent of 2018 is sitting right there in the public record, available for anyone who wants to draw the line. Two threads remain genuinely unresolved, and they are worth sitting with. The first: what exactly are the enrichment thresholds in the current draft, and who inside the Iranian government has actually agreed to them? The distance between what a negotiator accepts in a room and what the Revolutionary Guard Council will tolerate has historically been one of the most consequential gaps in Iranian diplomacy. We don't have clear visibility into that gap right now. The second: what is the actual mechanism for oil sanctions relief, and on what timeline? Because if the relief is conditional on compliance benchmarks that take years to verify, then the economic pressure that has made Iran's domestic situation so volatile continues, and the hardliners who benefit from that volatility continue to have the argument that engagement doesn't work. That argument has consequences. It has consistently had consequences. And we should watch very carefully whether the current framework has a credible answer to it.